here because one of our key persons from the trenches, as they say, is here, or from the beaches of Normandy. Now. Ah, hi. Look at that. Close. Grüß dich. Nice to see you. So we announced this as a bit of forestry technical network meeting, which it is, except that I don't think we have anyone from any of the decentralized offices connected. Partly because I guess your part of the world is now deep asleep, and if anyone from the opposite side of the globe, from East Asia, wanted to learn about the Caribbean, they have not registered that interest for the moment. So we pretty much do a face-to-face, which is good, and I think we have a wonderful show of hands here. And so again, good morning, everyone. Maybe let's do a quick round, starting with Klaus.
Yes, so I'm the Regional Forestry Officer for the Caribbean. I've been doing that for almost 20 years now. For the first 19 years, I was based in Barbados, and then I was transferred with a short stint in Trinidad to Suriname. In Suriname, I'm the base as an outposted technical officer, and at the same time, I am representing FAO in Suriname, but I'm not the FAO representative. So it's an FAO experiment, which we will see how it works. I sit in the Ministry of Agriculture, have an office there, and a laptop, and that's practically it. And from there I work, and that's it. So I'm now here to give you the opportunity to first to see and that the Regional Forestry Officer for the Caribbean is real, it's not a fake news. Second, I want to give you an introduction to what are the specifics of the Caribbean. And third, give you the opportunity to ask anything you want to know about the Caribbean.
I'm Leticia Piña, Forestry Officer in the Global Forest Research Assessment. Same for the consultant and the first.
Morning, everybody. Welcome to from Klaus. Nice to see you in person. It's true, you're real. Serena Fortuna, I'm the regional advisor for Red Plus in Latin America and liaison with the headquarters, and also.
I'm also on mobility. I go to transfer to Bangkok.
Okay.
A position of
I'm Elaine Sergey, Forestry Officer in Forest and Water. We're currently at this moment.
Okay.
Good morning. I'm Anita Barnes, and I'm working as a Forestry Officer in Forest and
Okay, good.
Good morning. We met yesterday. Doug Bajani, Chief Policy Resources, started in November.
Okay, good.
Yeah, I'm Shukri Ahmed. I'm an economist. I think I'm the only economist here of the resilience team for shocks and crises for the agricultural livelihoods.
You speak too early. There is another.
There's another
economist over there. My name is Dawei Jiang, which is met a minute ago. This is my second week actually start of third week of my role in FAO. I'm the team leader for climate change and resilience.
I'm Christian Scaduto, I'm a ghost. I'm not here. Just please speak louder, like there was somebody there, because we're recording to make it available for the people that couldn't attend. So speak louder, like there was somebody.
This is the one.
It covers normally the whole room, but we have to speak a little louder.
And I'm Andrei Kushin. I'm Deputy Director in November. Doug here, and covering 4 teams, including water and mountains, including forest governance and economics, forest products and statistics, and FLEG-T.
And I'm Eva Müller, I'm the director of the division.
So, Klaus, again, welcome from everyone here. You already met, I understand, a lot of people yesterday, and great that you made it here for face-to-face interactions, and we all really value an opportunity to really get our fingers dirty in a sense of really understanding what are the realities on the ground in terms of how we from here wanted, or we discussed, I guess we both agreed that would be useful for you to talk about is, I mean, you present essentially the topic that you wanted to present, and then we could go through a bit of an interaction, given the diversity of the teams represented here. And also, I would want to stress and recognize the importance of having the Deputy Director for the ESP5 team here, Shukri. That's obviously his interest in being here shows that we have a good momentum coming up in addressing many of the issues that are central to your sub-region. So, okay. Klaus, go ahead.
Have something that I can move the presentation forward? I will okay, good. So, start with the next one. That is the theme. You know who I am. That is what I'm going to talk about. Where are the forests in the Caribbean? When I speak of the Caribbean, I refer to the English-speaking Caribbean. The office out of Barbados had the responsibility for all the island, including Dominican Republic, Cuba, Haiti, and then about 3 years ago, Cuba and Dominican Republic are now being attended by Panama. So we, from the sub-regional office in Barbados, we basically cover CARICOM. CARICOM is the economic unification of the former English colonies with a couple of adjacent or related governments or states. So it's basically the English-speaking Caribbean we are talking about now here as the Caribbean. The Caribbean is wider. There's a Central American part of it, but the two areas are basically don't have much to do with each other. So that's important to know. I think the last person who was able to travel without any problems through the Caribbean of crossing the language borders was Columbus. After that, there's a very strict, there's a large difficulties in crossing language borders with a plane. Seems to be possible. There are good connections between the countries, the English-speaking countries, between the Spanish-speaking countries and the French-speaking countries, but it's always difficult to cross between islands who have different languages. And it didn't get better over the last 20 years. I have a map from my father-in-law from 40 years ago. There were far more connections through the Caribbean, crisscross, than they are now. Now we are pretty much centralized, also mentally. All flight connections go to Miami, and some to London, and very few to Latin America. So it is basically it's an island, a regional island in the continent. Now, what happened in these areas? Now, what happened to the forest? How does it change? What are the drivers of degradation, resilience, and what is we can observe in restoration? And so these are the topics which deal with forestry matters. And then I will put this whole thing into a larger context, which I call here the social dimension. Next one. Now, quick overview. In the Caribbean, we have three basic groups of countries. They have the smaller islands, like Grenada, St. Vincent, Dominica, St. Lucia, all these small dots you see on the map. And we have the larger, the Greater Antilles. These are Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, Haiti, Cuba.
And we have the continental countries. The continental countries are basically Suriname, Guyana, and Belize. Now, when you look at the interesting part is that forest on the island covers roughly 1/3 of the land space, and with very high population densities. They are kind of similar between the larger and the smaller Antilles, about 250 people per square kilometer. Now, when you compare that with the continental countries, you have something like 80% forest cover, and you have 6 people per square kilometer. So that is that is important to understand. The continental countries retained their forest, but they retained the forest not so much because they loved the forest or they wanted it, there were just not enough people to cut it down. While on the islands, they have a very high population density. The land was used over the last 300 years for agriculture, and soon after the European colonizers arrived, the forest was cleared and the land was used for agriculture. Next one. Now, when we look at how this changed over the centuries, over the decades, we can differentiate between 3 different phases of forest in the landscape. The first one was basically the forest was a land reserve. Wherever forest was available, it was cut down, and it was an unregulated source for timber. Next one, that is the second phase now. Then the people realized, hey, wait a minute, maybe we should retain something of it. That is the second phase where forest reserves were established, timber harvesting regulations were established, and the forest was a source of timber and continued to be a land reserve for other land users. In this period, we see the establishment of forest plantation management, very little managing of natural forest or natural regeneration, and a few interventions in natural forests. I would say they basically remained at the experimental stage. So that is the situation on the islands. Next one. Now we have this third phase, which is basically the decline of agriculture. What happened? And we have an emerging secondary forest on agricultural land. The most interesting example of that, and in a way I would say the forerunner for all the other islands, maybe Puerto Rico. In the 1940s, Puerto Rico had a land forest cover of 8%, and the rest was sugarcane. After the sugarcane was abundant, then now the forest started to regenerate on its own, and the current forest cover is something of 70%. Most of the countries of the forest is the composition is species, introduced species. The most frequent tree in Puerto Rico is the African tulip tree. So we have a restoration of an ecosystem based or with basically foreign or introduced species. You can call them invasive. Whether they are considered to be invasive or not is the question, whether they are wanted or not. Leucaena, for example, was introduced as a fodder plant, was brought into the islands as the miracle tree. Everybody was very happy. The goats were supposed to eat it, and it was to generate carbon and all the good things. Now it basically regenerates large tracts of the island. It has an important ecological role in covering the watersheds, but it has very little economic value. So, next one. So what we have to learn from that is forest is changing, the vegetation cover is not static, it changes according to the demand for land, and what we can see is that generally, and that holds, forest is the last and the least appreciated land use. In Barbados, in the 20 years I was there, forest cover rose from probably 2 or 3% to something like now, I would say 20 or 25%. But it is this Leucaena bush. So, and I have had a discussion with my colleague from the agricultural department. I told him, the success of the reforestation of the Caribbean depends on the failure of the agricultural policy. People leave agriculture. Agriculture has a very low potential to generate income, and so the abundant land goes back into forest. Traditionally, the Caribbean islands had two main products. One was sugar, and the other one was banana. Both of them were kind of crippling along until the early 2000s, and then WTO took away the preferential trade access of these products to the European community, and that basically was the death of the export of both products. Next one. So I want to give you a few examples. Next one. So here you have a picture from Suriname. Lowland forest, which you can see on the left side, was converted into agriculture fields. That is a picture from the coastal area. Next one. This is a picture of the natural succession. You have a leucaena growing on an abundant sugarcane field. This is the early stages. You see the sugarcane still in the middle of it, and the leucaena growing up to a height of about 2 or 3 meters. Next one. If you have more water, and then you see that this forest cover develops into what we would call a complete or established secondary forest. It is, in this case, most of it is an introduced species. It is mixed also with native species. So, and hopefully, under the shadow of these invasive or primary forests, you have now a long-term introduction of the native species, which can actually happen. The risk is, like you see the small picture on the left, this process can be changed and reversed any time. For example, if there is an interest in palm oil, or if, and that is not so much the case for Barbados and for the islands, but residential areas. Every landowner in Barbados goes to bed every night and prays that his piece of agricultural land may be dedicated to become residential, because then he becomes, from a poor man, he will become a millionaire overnight. And if he has good political contacts and he has any kind of ways of connections that his land may be dedicated to, as zoned as a residential area, or then that is the interest in it. So the land is, again, basically is a land reserve of the forest. The people are waiting until they get the permission to change it into something which is sellable and makes money. Next one. In the mountain areas and more on the larger islands, let's say Jamaica, Dominican Republic, Cuba, you have still agriculture as a slash and burn agriculture. Let's say, especially on the larger island, let's say Jamaica and Dominican Republic, you can observe that the good agricultural lands in the coastal areas are abundant or left alone, but poor people in the upper watersheds still have to continue to do their slash and burn agriculture. If the island is small enough that the people who live up in the hills can reach the coastal area where they can find employment in the hotel industry, then this threat is not so high. As soon as the island grows, more people are bigger. The island doesn't grow, but if the island is bigger, then you see there is still a risk of converting mountain forest into agriculture land. It is, in general, next picture. It is the risk. This risk is currently not too high because there are little export crops which cultivated in this area. Other threats are, you see here, a golf course in Carriacou. So again, forest converted into a golf course, or let's say the next one is St. Lucia. You see a swimming pool in front of the pitons, and so very kind of it's very attractive for high value residential properties, and most of them, or many of them, are owned by foresters, by foreigners. And there was a change in the land regulations. Since about 5 to 10 years, foreigners were allowed to buy land on the Caribbean islands. This created a certain boom in the building industry, which lasted until 2008, the collapse of the let's say of the world economy, then all these kind of loose money which was around to invest into second homes in the Caribbean was no longer available, and the rising land prices in the Caribbean slowed down, and also the demand for these high properties. But I'm pretty sure it will come back. So as soon as there are again back enough rich people who don't know what to do with their money, we will have another set of these residents going up on these islands. Next one. Another, you see here a condominium, let's say the mangrove areas in the coastal areas in the Caribbean islands, the mangrove areas, especially on the smaller islands, which were steep, were very small. But there were small pockets of mangroves, but most of them were gone now, and they are converted into marinas, into ports and condominiums close to the hotels close to the sea. In Belize, the situation is a little bit different. They have large extension of mangroves, and many of them were converted into shrimp farming. Next one. We have this a picture from the port of Spain. You see, rural areas are abundant. Everybody moves into the city, and it gives you an idea of the typical problem of a urban area in the Caribbean. It is located at the shoreline, and you have the mountain areas right in the back, which are difficult to settle. So all the people basically sit on a very small strip of land along the coastline, with the back to the mountains and the front to the sea. What you see there is you see at the upper corner of the picture a large green area, which is left alone. This was bought by the first British governor of Trinidad in 1800 and something. It was an estate. He bought it and gave it to the city with the dedication that no permanent building should be erected on that place. So these 75 hectares are still open, and funny enough, it was respected for the last 200 years, and it is now kind of a green lung in the city. So, but it is really the exception. Everything else normally is cast in concrete. Next picture. Logging, let's say as it is pictured here, is not likely to happen neither in Guyana nor in Suriname. What you have there is a selective logging at rates which are rather low. The interventions take about 5 to 10 cubic meters per hectare, so it's very low, although the destruction connected with this logging, it damages far more trees than this 10 hectares. To what extent the best picture to describe that with what you see on the left top, Suriname, Guyana export the majority of their logs as round logs, and that is really a problem. There's very little kind of value-adding industry in these two countries, and the same applies for Belize. Next one. A problem on the islands is unmanaged wildfire. Here you have a picture right after a fire. Next one. And this fire is very often associated with invasive grasses. Here it is lemongrass. Lemongrass was introduced in Antigua. It's a picture from Antigua to stabilize the land. The lemongrass now became invasive, and it has a very bad habit. It burns, and every time it burns, it eats itself another 10 or 15 meters into the dry forest, and then the affected areas sprout back as lemongrass. So it's kind of creeping into the forest, and the reason for the fact that it burns is it's not naturally that it ignites by itself. It is put on fire by people who use the lemongrass when it grows back to feed their cattle, because the land is not is owned by the government, and the government only gives it out on short-term leases for a year, to farmers, so there is very little incentive to have a sustainable program for land husbandry. So the problem here is the invasive grass, but the underlying problem is the land tenure system and the little incentive for people to really invest and to prevent to invest into good agricultural and husbandry practices. And the reason for that not to happen is that the land is basically used as a political currency. So if somebody wants land from the government, then it is something politicians can give away. And this mixture actually results in this spreading of the lemongrass. It's not a natural disaster, it's a combination of a political one and a natural situation. Next one. In especially Suriname and Guyana, we have the problem of bauxite mining and gold mining. Bauxite is the raw material for aluminium, was the mainstay of the economy in Suriname, is now the bauxite mines in Suriname are closed. They are still ongoing in Guyana and some of them in Jamaica. The real threat is the gold mining. Gold mining is done in two levels. There are industrial companies who do it, who have concessions. And then there are, I would say, 10,000s of people, what you see on the right side, the person there with a pan washing gold out of the river. These artisanal gold miners are using large amounts of mercury. This mercury ends up in the river and poisons the fish populations. Even if they don't die, they accumulate the mercury, and in the end, the population of the people eat the largest fish, which have eaten the smaller fish, and so you have a natural accumulation of mercury in the fish, and then it ends up in the human body. Next one. So, summarizing it, drivers for degradation in the Caribbean. One is, let's say, trying to make money with whatever is possible. You see the famous figure. And the other side is, let's say, poverty. That is especially the case when, let's say, in the upper areas where slash and burn agriculture is still the fact. Poverty in the continental countries with indigenous communities does not have a real effect on the forest. These communities have their cost gruntius. These are areas which they have traditionally harvested or in which they have cut down the forest, and they use the land for agriculture to produce cassava and dryland rice, and they return to the same places after 5 to 10 years. So that is not, let's say, the low population density and the returning practice is not really a threat to the forest. It is, if at all, it is on the larger islands, Jamaica, Dominican Republic, where you have this still as an issue of slash and burn agriculture in the higher mountain areas. Next one. So also the widespread and extensive deforestation in the Caribbean came to a halt. You can observe natural forest recovery, but there is some degradation of biodiversity. It is mainly in sensitive forest types. So mangroves are highly threatened, and another area which is highly threatened are dry forest systems. The upper areas, the wetter forest is more or less protected, I would say. But the dry forest, which is on the leeward side of the island, were the preferred areas for human settlements, and these are the areas which are basically disappearing. And these are also the areas which are highly susceptible to invasive species and damages to recurrent forest fires. Next one. So, what is it, what needs to be done? In the urban setting, basically try to retain every green area which is possible, increase the tree cover in agricultural systems. There is a tradition of having agricultural systems combined with trees. It's called gardening. Invest in forest plantation, because that is instead of having, let's say, a reforestation by default, it is kind of interesting to see that although it is an island with very limited land resources, there is a large amount of idle land available. What needs to be done is an active zoning against forest by default, and the preparation of forest management plans is where do we want to have what type of forest and how should we manage it. Next one. So what are income opportunities from forest? Basically, when I look at the islands, we have the opportunity to use the forest for ecotourism activities. The islands basically live on tourism. It's normally a beach tourism, but the people tend to get bored on the beach after some time, and that is an opportunity to invite them to see some of the forest. The advantage is that the forest is very close, so in a day trip, this can be accommodated, and it gives an opportunity to generate money from ecotourism activities or through tour guiding. Another option is non-timber forest products. It's preparing kind of souvenirs for tourists who are flocking the islands is another opportunity how you can make money. And on the islands still, although it is chainsaw logging, it is artisanal production of timber. It has a long tradition on the island and still has some potential. All of the three above are basically niche developments or niche markets. It is not, let's say, don't expect that hundreds of people can live from it. It's a few families who can make a living in a population of, let's say, 80,000. But it was very interesting to see, for example, we did an analysis on charcoal, and we were surprised on one of the islands in St. Vincent's that the total amount of charcoal which was produced, estimated, was something in the magnitude of $300,000 US being sold every year. So it is often forgotten, the whole economic aspects of it, and it kind of sails under the radar because many of it happens in the informal sector. It doesn't appear in no statistics, but it still offers livelihood opportunity for people who are living on the islands, and we should not forget that. On the continental countries, there's a real need to improve value added and wood processing. Suriname exports 500,000 cubic meters of roundwood. Most of it goes to East China, Southeast Asia, and it is basically it's a pure it's a exploitation of resources, and they just go on the ship and that's it, and they disappear, and with very little kind of revenue really remaining in the country. Next one. So these are some recommendations. Make forestry more sustainable, and in brackets, and very important, has to be financially sustainable. Improve the planning system, strengthen monitoring and control and sanction. The key thing is basically implement what is planned. We have a lot of tradition of planning in the Caribbean, but very little of it is actually implemented. Next point is concentrate government involvement on monitoring and facilitation. Many of the forestry departments in the Caribbean are still of the belief that they want to get involved in plantation, in operating a sawmill, and I always kind of pull out my hairs, the remaining one, and I say, look, do you really have the capacity to do that? Well, I remember my first visit to Grenada they introduced me to a forest plantation. I could fine. And what are you doing with the trees who are standing there? We are going to cut them down. So why don't you cut them down? No, because the chainsaw is not working. What's wrong with the chainsaw? Yeah, it is dull. The chain is dull. Okay, good. Then sharpen it. You have a file. I can show you how it does. No, we have a voucher with the PS to buy a file. So basically, they needed an administrative procedure from the permanent secretary to buy a new file to sharpen the chainsaw. And if you have this instrument, you never get, let's say, economic, financially, businesses going. encourage small-scale forest-based entrepreneurship to make the use of forest resources more valuable, and support private sector investment, for example, tax incentives for forest plantation and forest management from non-forestry businesses. Because there are a lot of people, let's say you have to see it as a social process. People move from the rural areas into the city. Many of them climb up the social ladders. Their parents were farmers, and they now are dentists, teachers, lawyers. But they still have the land in the rural areas. They don't want to get into agriculture because they don't have the time to do that. But they have the money, they could invest that money into setting up forest plantations. And it is actually very lucrative. I have calculated it. The investment you plant, if you have the land, is something in the magnitude of almost 20% the return you get. But there's very little culture of doing long-term investments. People prefer to leave the land fallow for 10 or 15 years instead of investing into a forest plantation and then reaping the benefit after 20 years. If I convince these people who have basically, I would say, they are beyond the problem of solving their day-to-day life, they have savings, they could invest the money, it's very hard to convince these people to tell them, say, look, invest into a forest plantation and after 25 or 30 years you will gain quite a bit of money, which would come right when your daughters want to get married or when you want to retire, so then you have a cushion. There are some examples of people who are doing it. I have tried to invite these people to present to others, and it works. These people have been doing it. They say, no, I wanted to do a trip to China, and the only thing I had to do, I went into my forest, I cut 400 trees, and then I had the money to go on holiday to China. But still, it is a problem to do long-term, or the willingness to invest into these forest-related long-term businesses. The other thing is recognize and compensate for forest-based services. Let's say payments for water in the English-speaking Caribbean. That is very unlikely to happen because the most of the forest belongs to the government, and the water authorities also belong to the government. So basically, it is like putting money from one pocket into the other. It isn't really. It is different on countries like the Dominican Republic, where the forest is largely privately owned. Then you can have an incentive scheme to give money to people to keep the forest. But in the English-speaking Caribbean, where the water authorities as well as the forest is government-owned, it doesn't really make any sense to encourage these payments. Next one. So now we come to we're leaving the forest. We look at the bigger picture. Food security is a big problem in the Caribbean, although there is no incidence, let's say, or very few incidences of kind of hunger or malnutrition. But you see here the total expenditure for food, for importing food, rose over the from 1990 to 2011, from $1 billion to $4.4 billion annually. So 4 times the amount in 10 years. It rose it quadrupled. The export remained basically the same. So it rose from 1 billion to 1.4 billion. 60 to 80% of the food which is consumed on the island is imported. So God forbid if the ships with the food don't reach the islands, after 2 weeks we are going to start to eat each other. And the problem is also the imported food, the people spending the money to import food to eat themselves to death. The obesity rate, especially in the female population, is over 70%. And the result of it is very high medical costs, which are likely to increase over the next 20 years. So we have a little bit of a bizarre situation. We have a large amount of idle land, which was used before in agriculture, It is not used anymore. On the other side, we have the economies or the countries spend huge amounts of money to import food, and the imported food changed the dietary habits of the people so that they are, in very few words, they're getting too fat, and you have high blood pressure and all these non-communicable diseases, which will result, maybe not now, but over the next 10 or 20 years, in very high medical costs. Because before they die, they normally spend a lot of money in the hospitals. Another big problem, so to say, is in general the institutional weaknesses of not only the forest institution, also many other institutions are not functioning anymore. In the 1950s, the Caribbean countries has a very good system of agricultural extension. They had stations where the farmers could go, get seedlings, get plants, where they were taught to certain land husbandry practices. All these agricultural stations basically are not functioning anymore. The same, to a large extent, happens to the forestry departments. On the smaller islands, they are, in some cases, they're basically vanishing. In the case of Grenada, it was established in the 1970s, 1960s. All the people who were employed over the last, or at the beginning, are now about to retire. And I think in Grenada, there's only one forester left. Because of structural adjustment programs, the positions are not filled anymore. In other islands, it's not that bad. In general, I would say, over the many years I was in the Caribbean, I would say the forestry departments in Jamaica and Grenada have really improved. But Guyana, they have really improved. They got better. All the others declined in their quality. So they are not really functioning as they should. There's a lack of long-term planning, and maybe not so much planning, that is why I wrote it very small, but implementation. There are lots of plans developed, but none of them, or very few, are kind of really stuck to and implemented. Now we come to the last point, is the effect of climate change. It is expected that hurricanes will be more vicious, they will come more frequently, and we have also increased incidence of drought. So the weather extremes are expected to become more extreme, which will result in drought, which will affect agriculture as well as, let's say, human settlements. And this is the same, I guess, basically the same you are now experiencing here in Rome. The wells are running dry, and people are scratching their heads and trying to find out where to get the water from. Sea level rise is being talked about a lot, although there is, let's say, from my point of view, the whole issue of sea level rise and climate change is more used on political platforms in order to, and is seen as an opportunity to get external funding. The willingness really to change and to make long-term investments in change is pretty much linked or depends on external funding, which then gives me the question how sustainable it is. So more needs to be done than just investing huge amount of money. It requires a considerable change in the attitude. In Suriname, I can give you a very clear example. Suriname is very low-lying. Most of the agricultural land is at sea level. You can see the river, the Suriname River, flows 5 hours out into the sea, and then it flows 5 hours back into the land. The agricultural land in the coastal area was cultivated 250, 300 years by the Dutch because they introduced a very strict system of water management. When the water was low, they closed the drainage, so the salt water remained outside. And when the water was low, they opened the drainage and the water drained out into the river. This system worked. Now it is expected it will be a threat if the sea level rises. But the problem is currently that the discipline of closing and opening these gates is not there. So they just remain open. So the seawater gets into the land and makes this agricultural soil salty. And then the plants die. And the salt water comes from below. So when you plant on the topsoil, the trees, your sweet pepper or agricultural products grow quite well until they reach the salt water level. And then they die. So it's not really a problem of climate change. It's a problem of management. So there are two things. One is if the sea level may rise, then you need to improve the sea defense. But at the same time, it doesn't make sense to improve the sea defense if you don't introduce a management system which is implemented with the necessary discipline. So that is, these are the two areas on let's say on the climate change. Next one. So we have what is it we can look at? We have in my presentation I said we have to do everything to make forest management more profitable. That is basically what is our traditional mandate and what we have been doing for the last 50 or 60 years. Now the other opportunity is to tap into green climate funding, but it really needs support, kind of attitude change towards long-term vision, and it needs to include the strengthening of the governments and the institutions. Otherwise, this will be the investments in these areas will not be sustainable. Thank you. That's it. Talk too long. I didn't want to talk that long.
Yeah. We have scheduled this for 1 hour, and we're only 12 minutes left. But I wonder if we could, if people have a little bit more time, we could try to see if we can stretch it by 10, 15 minutes. Those who can stay, and I suggest maybe if you could make another small point as to where, I mean, this is what you're saying, there's opportunities. Can you maybe give a picture on how FAO has been so far engaged and where is the engagement now? And this will lead us into maybe a quick initial discussion as to where FAO can be more proactive and more useful and more in demand in terms of what the governments want, what we can deliver, and what could be useful. I mean, in addition to GCF projects.
Okay, so what on the islands, I would say, kind of try to open up of a forest-based livelihood opportunities. Although we know it's a kind of it's a niche market, try to strengthen the linkages between trying to make money out of the forest and then that way trying to protect the forest. That's one pocket. On the continental countries, I would say especially Suriname, Guyana, to some extent Belize, encourage, let's say, the downstream processing of wood products. So these are two areas, forest related. Now, when I come to the opportunities, funding opportunities under the Green Climate Fund, we can look into, let's say, ridge to reef approaches, kind of looking at how linking the forest and on the upper watersheds with the agricultural lands and the urban areas, kind of have a kind of an integrated approach to development of these, let's say, watersheds. That is where we can play a role. We can definitely contribute to it, and by making these, let's say, watersheds or areas more resilient, we actually prepare the country for the expected climate change impacts. So that is what is we can use. The problem I see with especially with the green climate funding, is that it is large, very large sums of money. Talking about, let's say, the smallest one of 10 to 20 million US dollars. If you throw 10 or 20 million US dollars at a population of 100,000 people, it will not have much of an effect. So what we should try to do, and if we have any way of kind of getting these or applying for this climate change money and trying to break it up into more palatable pieces for the islands.
Readiness proposals.
Yeah,
I mean, this is what we are doing a lot now. And those are smaller amounts of money in the hundreds of thousands.
Yeah, that is something, because we need to encourage kind of a process in the islands, not kind of using this money when it comes. We need to have internalize and start a change process in the thinking, which is it's a very long-term thing. We cannot expect any results from it in the next 2 or 3 years or 5 years or whatever. As I said, it's a very long-term program.
And you mentioned the integrated watershed management, and in your earlier slides, I mean, the biggest driver for political economy was this whole land, land being the political currency. What's your sense? And again, it may be difficult to generalize from country to country, but maybe we can do it to an extent. The existing institutional structures. I mean, how is there like anyone there listening or ready to talk about integrated watershed management? I mean, what would be the entry point for these types of interventions institutionally? Is it where the political power is? Is it the cities? Is it the land agencies? Is it because I mean, if we keep talking to the non-existent or increasingly non-existent forest agencies, then you are starting a lose-lose game from the very beginning.
It depends. It changes from island to island, and most of it, if things are successful, they are linked to personalities. So it is not so much, let's say, the kind of a blueprint to what institution to talk to. It is who is there currently has political influence, who has the capacity to influence the decision making, and that has to be carefully analyzed and then go and try to work on it. For example, in Suriname, I am now working to convince the permanent secretary from the Ministry of Agriculture that the two of us go together to the Ministry of Finance, who is the focal point for the Green Climate Fund, and we end up to sit together with him and the Ministry of Finance to get the two of them to talk to each other. That is the first thing. There is this opportunity, but if they don't talk to each other, then they will never get anything. And that is and was the problem with JEF funding in the Caribbean. Generally, the JEF funding was, the focal points were the ministries of environment or health, and they were the focal point for JEF projects, or many JEF projects. So in the Ministry of Agriculture or the Forestry Department very often didn't really know who was the focal point in the countries. When I asked them, the forestry people or the agricultural people say, look, what's with JEF projects? They look at you, no, this is being done by UNDP, you have nothing to do with that. So wait a minute, first of all, it's your JEF focal point you have to talk to. and then trying to convince to get the forester or the chief agricultural officer to go to the Jeff focal point and say, look, let's sit down and what is it you want to do? And so it's different in every island, but it has kind of a very personalized approach. There's little of kind of a blueprint. What we can do in the regions, we can, if you are kind of developing on a kind of a land and water program or something like that, we are in the islands, we are in the together with the FAORs, and we in the islands we have the opportunity to kind of connect you to the people, or to make the connection to the people who, or also to the islands where we currently think there's a political constellation which is promising.
One of the things that we are trying to also show or indicate is actually do sectorally how each sector, including forestry, contributes to livelihood resilience, especially agricultural livelihood, whether it's crops, whether whoever it is, and how forests and trees actually being a crucial element of that. And we're going about it by having studies, and now some colleagues in forestry are actually doing some contribution to a study that we're doing every year. One is the damage and loss to shocks. So any type of shock, whether it's natural, hurricane, whatever, trying to show what the damages are on the one hand, but on the other, what areas with forests and non-forests would do in the damage and loss study. And this is with the statistics office, we're setting up a regular database by sector. The other one is returns on investment. And this is, although the things we do are long term, for what we have is trying to show whatever has been done in the past, what is it now that it is doing. So any information and data that is there is to make the case both for the government, but also for the international community. So forests and trees are very much in that. What is the return on investment in terms of really withstanding shocks and showing it in the livelihood of people? How different is it a well-managed area as opposed to a non-area? Are there any indications, or could it be one of the works that FAO could also start thinking of really having that kind of data sets to make the case?
It's kind of a difficult kind of question, because when I look at the kind of defined baselines, very often then you say, what is the, if we don't do anything scenario? Very often we end up in the Caribbean, we are ending up now with a voluntary forest, which has very good values when it comes to the protection of the watershed. It has very little economic value. So because the trees who grow there are not really usable for anything. When you transfer that now into the carbon thinking, your scenario of not doing anything actually creates a forest. No, which is, it's different, very much different from other areas of the world. We don't have, let's say, when you go to Central America, you have an agricultural frontier. You have increased deforestation and eating up the forest. In the Caribbean, we don't have that. We have a natural regeneration of the forest, which makes, by default, the landscape more resilient. So basically, if we don't do anything, we have already a very high positive impact. Not bad. But it makes it very difficult to kind of to define these baselines, and then based on that kind of prove that your management interventions you do are better than the non-action version. But that's kind of, it's a problem.
But on the damage and loss, still it works, because whether it is naturally regenerated or because of investment, if a hurricane hits and an area that has a better forest cover, as opposed to a non-forest cover, would that kind of also argument?
When a hurricane hits an island, it depends on the strength of the hurricane, and it destroys everything, which is completely out of our range. Even then, when we have the second part of, let's say, after the wind is gone, or let's say the wind is one set of the impact, the other set is the large and extended rain. Not only and necessarily related to hurricanes. You can have it also as what they call low-level trough. So in 4 to 5 hours, you can get up to 300, 400 millimeters of rainfall. Now, when the rain falls on the forests, let's say the first, 5 to 10 millimeters are absorbed by the canopy. Then the next, we must be better than that. The next, let's say 20 or 30 or 40 are absorbed by the litter and infiltration. Then comes some point which maybe at 100 millimeters or maybe at 60. Whatever you pour on top of the forest comes out at the bottom. There's no benefit difference from whether it is in the forest or it is outside the forest. I had, in the area where I lived in Trinidad, we had one day rainfall with 250 millimeters. It was a very small area of maybe about 5 or 6 kilometers in diameter, and it just rained the whole day. After that, I went into the forest, and the amount of erosion you saw on the forest floor was nothing different from what you saw on the areas which didn't have any forest. And these, so in both cases, when the rain aspect of the hurricane as well as the wind aspect, whatever you do in the forest, you don't have any effect of the management. You can do maybe a little bit of thinning, but it has no impact, because the type of hurricane which hits, if it is a category 1, which goes up to, let's say, 60 or 70 miles, or when it is category 5, over 200 kilometers of wind speed, everything crumbles. And there's nothing, and we have to be very careful in not promising the people that we can do anything with it, because we will lose our credibility. And this has been in the Caribbean all the time. The hurricane will hit, it will destroy the forest, but the forest will come back on its own. And that is, in Belize, you can see the different generations of mahogany are basically linked to the incidence of hurricanes, because the mahogany needs clear areas to regenerate. And the same applies I have seen over the last years many of the hurricanes. It looks disastrous, but it basically comes back.
So, yeah, I mean, I'm just mindful of the time, and people may start disappearing. So, if we have, who has like the urge to say something, and then maybe we'll leave it to kind of more bilateral
yes.
conversation.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thanks, but yeah, thanks. So, yeah, Thomas.
A very quick one, Klaus. It was interesting what you said about the forest and water, and that's why Elaine will probably follow up with you. Because you said that forestry and water, in most cases, are in the setting in the government.
Yeah.
Is there any other way to put an incentive that still the government increases its positive perception of trees and forests for the water services? Because that's, yeah, even if it's in the quota in the government, I mean, there is a need to increase that knowledge or not. Is there any other way this could be done?
Now, first of all, one has to be careful with in St. Lucia, for example, they had a reservoir which was surrounded by forest. The reservoir was, and it was pretty much, is pretty much an undisturbed forest, although the reservoir now is completely filled up. Which had about 4 or 5 meters of water is now down to 50 or 60 centimeters. So the benefits of the forest is maybe not as big as we think it is, especially in the cases of high rainfall incidences.
So what I just said before.
Yeah, so it is, we have the positive effect of the reduced erosion in the bracket of, let's say, I'm guessing, kind of between rainfall incidences between 40 millimeters and maybe, or between 20 and 60, something like that. There is where the forest cover makes a difference. But if we have a high incident of rainfall, which goes above, let's say, 100 millimeters, then we have siltation of the watershed the same way. And that, when you can look at the hurricane patterns, you can say on an average over 200, 300 years, every 20 to 30 years you have a hurricane. But you can have a hurricane 1 year and the next one you have it again. Last year, 2 years ago, we had an area in Cuba was hit twice in the same year after 15 days. It was like 2 subsequent hurricanes hit the same place in 14 days' time, which I've never seen before. Normally, it's kind of spread out.
Sorry, Klaus, for clarification, when you say forest cover, what is the ground vegetation cover like under these forests? Because generally, when we say forest cover, we're referring to canopy cover. But when it comes to soil erosion, what's most important is often the ground vegetation. So to what extent is there a dense ground vegetation underneath the canopy? Or is this not the case in more mature forests?
No, you have that. So because let's say the natural forest is, I shouldn't say, it's not a homogeneous canopy like you compare it with the European beech forest, where you have stems or let's say a pine plantation. The exceptions are teak plantations. Teak plantations have exactly that feature, that you have very little understory, and that has to do with the fact that the teak, maybe because it was introduced, has a stronger potential to draw the last drop of water out of the soil, and as a result, all the underbush and the accompanying vegetation kind of dies out and is the first one which kind of shows severe effects of drought. Then on top, when it becomes even drier, then the teak trees drop their leaves, and then they bury everything. And the next stage is, especially in Trinidad, or only in Trinidad, we have teak plantations, and in Trinidad, you can bet on it, it will burn. Somebody will come and light it. So it burns then, even if it burns early, you're lucky, because then the fire will not be very hot, and it is not going to kill the teak trees. And then, in any case then, after that, at the beginning of the rainy season, you have a teak stand with no leaves, and you have a complete barren understory. It's just like if you go on a parking lot here. You see the mineral soil, and when you look carefully, you see all these kind of testifying stones. You see a stone like this sitting on a pillar of sand, and you can see, look, all of that was eroded. And that is why I am very careful in recommending teak as a plantation species. I I was never really convinced that that is a sustainable management of forest. Maybe if it would have been thinned more better or properly, then it would not have been that drastic the effect. But that's particularly crucial in the teak plantation. In the other natural forest, you have a well-developed understory because trees fall and then you have kind of patches where they regenerate. So it's you can compare it to say a mountain forest with spruce and beech here in Europe. So that is the picture you can have.
Can I ask you, are there some indications of influence of the forest cover for small-scale, say, emergencies like flash floods or buildings fall or landslide? Because we are saying about hurricane, but of course hurricane is very, let's say, rare and very powerful. What about small-scale or hazards with low intensity? Can we see the role of the forest cover there?
I think, let's say, in the Caribbean, most of the rainfalls are it's very intense. So if it rains, you can very likely and highly get rainfall incidences which are above 20 millimeters up to 40. And that in that bracket, the forest is important because that is where the effect, the positive effect of the forest really counts. And there you see the difference. In that bracket, you see which are the most rainfall incidences, let's say, over the year. There you see the benefit of the forest. When it gets more, then the benefit basically disappears.
Thanks, Klaus. We went out over our time, which was admittedly short, obviously, so we probably should have planned for more time, but that's what we have. And so whoever still wants to exhaust or continue a dialogue with Klaus, I think the room is still here. And I don't know about what your time is later this afternoon. Maybe we could also have a quick follow-up. But I mean, for now, we essentially need to wrap it up. And I really thank Klaus for the really wonderful intervention and your initiative to be here. And we'll really need to work out what we can then collectively do together to follow up and strengthen our presence in a useful and meaningful way, helping you do what you do, and all of us engage.
At least you know I'm real now.
Well, thank you so much. So, when does your schedule finish today?